bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, welcome to Society and the State. Connor Boyack, my co-host, is taking this interview off, but I'm very happy to be able to connect up with Angelo Codevilla. Angelo is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. He's a professor emeritus of international relations at Boston University. I know that there is more in terms of the hats that you wear. What have I left out about your life experience?
Well, having lived for 74 years, I've done a few things. I've been a naval officer, foreign service officer, worked on the staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee for 8 years, and been involved in all sorts of things, been on President Reagan's transition teams, written 13 books, but none of that makes anything that I say true or false.
Although it does give you a definite edge in terms of life experience, and you've seen a lot of things happen. I trust, based on what I have read in your writings, you have not just been passively letting the current carry you where you are, but you strike me as someone who's actually a pretty astute observer of what's going on.
I am an immigrant to this country. I was born and raised in Italy, came here at age 13, and instantly fell in love with the country. Actually, I was in love with it even before I got here. And I've seen a change, and I've observed these changes with some pain. But no, you're quite right. I've noted the changes, and I've done my very best to try to preserve the country that I first fell in love with.
Well, one of the things that really jumped out at me in your essay about After the Republic is, I know last year there was a great deal of anxiety over the election, and everything hangs on this election, but you have made a very strong case that the United States has been in a state of transition for some time. And I want to ask you, what are we transitioning from and to?
Well, what we are transitioning to is open to doubt. What we are transitioning from is a republic, a representative government, characterized by smallness and therefore by freedom. And what we're transitioning to, and I don't know how far we will go, is one in which virtually no part of the population is interested in maintaining small government. The left has made big government into its practical everyday objective. Bigger government means, among other things, more resources for themselves, material resources, and psychological resources, in that they get to command others and feel superior to them. And the right, at the same time, has grown impatient with the fact that representative institutions have not succeeded in halting this taking of power over lives by the left. And so in the 2016 election, there was certainly no predominant voice, no very powerful voice for constitutional government, for restraint. Neither side was for restraint. On both sides, you had people who were, in fact, abandoning the republic, abandoning the tradition of limited government. Both major sides wanted to do things quickly. Donald Trump says, you won't believe how quickly I can do things. Well, of course, he hasn't done any of that, but that's beside the point. The fact is that much of his constituency simply wanted to get what they wanted, regardless of what, which is essentially not so different from what the left wants, namely to get what it wants, regardless of what.
So they'll argue over how that power is divvied up, but never over whether they should be wielding that much power in the first place.
Well, that's right. The question is who will rule, not what will be the restraints on rule. There simply, unfortunately, seems to be broad agreements that there ought to be no restraints on rule.
I think that's an accurate way of describing it. And in your essay, you talk about how, for instance, on the Republican side, you had 17 hopefuls who stepped up to run for president, but not one of them dealt with the fact that today those in power, whether elected or unelected, pretty much do whatever they please.
Ted Cruz tried to do that, and he quickly found, being a smart politician, that people weren't listening to that. They were listening to Donald Trump, who pretended to say that he was going to himself fix things. He didn't say, well, look, back in 2009, Nancy Pelosi answered the question of what gives you the right to take over the entire healthcare system of the United States. Where does that right come from? Her answer was, are you kidding? Are you kidding?
This is when she's being asked where that power comes from in the Constitution.
Where do you get that power? Where does the power come from? And her answer was, are you kidding? Are you kidding? If Donald Trump had been asked, or were to be asked, where does the power come from to do X, Y, or Z? He would say, well, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Now, mind you, this is on a theoretical level. On a practical level, Donald Trump has been shy, to say the least, about using even obvious presidential powers. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that Donald Trump has been anything like the left in terms of power abuse. On the contrary, I mean, the man is so ignorant about the powers of the presidency that he actually believes that the CIA and the FBI grant security clearances. Of course they don't. It's he who grants them.
Interesting.
The president is the only power that does that. He's the one who clears the CIA and the FBI, not they who clear him. I mean, this is he has power. The presidency has powers of which he does not seem to be aware of. Never mind dictatorial powers. But that's another story.
No, it actually, this makes a great deal of sense, and you give some very concrete examples in your essay after the Republic about how the court has changed words that we would think would be easily understood. Teaching Americans the word public can mean private, as in Kelo versus City of New London, that penalty can mean tax, as in King versus Burwell, and that holding an opinion contrary to its own could only be due to an irrational animus, as we saw in Obergefell versus Hodges. It's not surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising, that the institution that probably has wielded more power, that has directly affected more people's lives in the past 40, 50 years, is probably the Supreme Court.
Well, it is, and what really hurts is that, as Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist 78, the power of the Supreme Court really comes from its ability to persuade. The length of its opinions, the scholarly apparatus of its opinions are meant to convince. But when you read decisions such as the ones you mentioned and many, many others, the court has actually given up any pretense of trying to persuade. It hectors or simply states, hey, we've got the power, we've got a majority, and the rest of you go to hell. Well, this leads the other side to say, okay, we'll get the power and to hell with you. Again, this is not a republic anymore. What is happening right now after the 2016 election is quite simply that the refusal of the left to accept the results simply dares the right to act as the left has been acting. In other words, my latest essay in the Claremont Review of Books is entitled the Cold Civil War. We have gotten into a situation of where nobody is trying to persuade anybody else, but simply trying to raise the willingness of one's own side to fight the other side, whatever that means. And we haven't faced the fact yet that when rational persuasion, when appeal to something that is true and valid above all opinions, when that is given up, ultimately violence is the only arbiter. I mean, that's simply logic. And I mean, that has to be faced in order for anybody to pull back from their pretensions.
And we will link to your essay, The Cold Civil War, with Angelo Codevilla. One of the things that you point out here is power. And this is something that I think is not understood well by a majority of our fellow Americans, and that is the nature of power, or where political power originates. Right now, it appears that most of our political systems have done a fantastic job of bypassing any kind of accountability to the people. And I wonder if you could walk us through who actually exercises and holds the reins of power in America today, if that power is no longer in the hands of the people.
When I worked in the Senate, this is not all that long ago. We're talking about 30 years ago. It's not the Dark Ages. The path to legislation power was the Congress. Now, in Congress, a bill would arrive, or a president or a request for funding and authority from an executive agency would arrive. It would go to a subcommittee, the requisite subcommittee, which would hold hearings. In those hearings, each side would try to make its case for and against each individual provision, at the end of which the subcommittee would hold a markup where the committee would vote on individual items within that small amount of power requested. Votes would be taken publicly. Everything would then go to full committee. Same process: hearings, markups, votes. Go to the floor. You would have votes again. Meanwhile, votes on not only on the bill but on amendments. Meanwhile, the committee and subcommittee staffs would do due diligence. They would do oversight and make a case for spending more of this, less of that, cutting this out, adding that. None of that happens today. What happened instead is that congressmen and senators found that it was easiest for them to do what they wanted if they didn't pass any bills, if they didn't do any of the above, but rather let everything slide until the end of the session. And then they would throw everything together, and at which point there would be no chance for anyone to do due diligence, accountability, oversight. Everything would be lumped together, and the only choice would be to vote for continuing this function of government or not. So this, of course, is the now familiar choice between voting yes for everything and voting to shut down the government. Who exercises power now? Well, instead of the individuals in Congress, in various committees who act publicly, now you have leadership groups, staff primarily, who work behind closed doors alongside lobbyists of the executive branch primarily, but also of favored interests. And they do so totally outside of public accountability. That's what's happening now. We haven't had real, honest-to-goodness congressional action of the kind that we had for 200 years for the past 10 years.
One of the points that you make in your essay, After the Republic, you point out that our imperial regime works on a very simple principle. The president and the cronies who populate these channels, these executive, judicial, bureaucratic, and social kinship channels, can do whatever they like so long as the bureaucracy obeys, and 1/3 + 1 of the Senate protects the president from impeachment. And you say if you're on the right side of that network, essentially you can make up the rules as you go along. You can ignore or violate any number of laws, and you can be certain of your peers' support.
That is the real U.S. Constitution today. For example, what I've just said concerning the so-called omnibus bills or continuing resolutions is a total negation of Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which says that no money can be taken from the Treasury except by appropriation by law. Well, literally, these continuing resolutions are laws, but certainly not in the spirit of the meaning of the word, because, in fact, there has been no due consideration, no responsible action by the representatives of the people. It's government in the United States has become an inside thing, which, by the way, explains the reaction of these people to the very possibility, to the mere possibility, that power might be taken away from them. Look at the way Mitch McConnell, for example, has behaved. He has aimed primarily not to repeal Obamacare or do anything else. He has worked primarily to preserve the current system in the Senate, in the Congress, which allows him and a handful of other people to control what actually happens legislatively.
So let me ask you this, Angelo. How does this happen in a nation that prides itself on being, the freest nation on earth? And frankly, we still enjoy a lot of freedoms that other nations don't. But there's no denying we have taken a long, long walk in the wrong direction. How does that happen? We have every first world convenience. We have all the information that you would think would keep us in the know and able to head this off at the pass. But it still has happened. Where did we drop the ball?
This has happened because you can point to all sorts of causes, all of which have operated, including a corrupt educational system, especially at the university level. Speaking strictly politically, it has happened because of the corruption of the Republican Party. There is not in the United States a genuine alternative to the party of government. You have two parties, two politically powerful groups, which, however, represent the very same interests and who are really not in opposition to one another. Now, what happened in 2016 is that on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, but primarily on the Republican side, the voters were demanding what one might call an anti-government party, a check on this uniparty of power. Again, the Bernie Sanders movement was made up of people who felt, for whatever reason, cut out their lives not in their own control, which is not all that terribly different from how people on the right side of the spectrum in the Republican Party have felt. The only difference being that the ones on the right have been far more disenfranchised than those on the left. I mean, the polls have shown for many years that whereas a majority of Democratic voters are satisfied with the conduct of those whom they elect, only fewer than 1 in 4 Republican voters are satisfied with the conduct of Republican office holders.
So we've come to expect the ruling class to behave as it does. I know that there are those, myself included, who, we dream of a day when the ruling class, gets its just desserts, or at least is removed from power and direct control over our lives. But that would not be enough to restore the republic. You point out in your essay after the republic that it would be a start, but some other things would have to happen for America to be the America that it once was. Can we touch on what some of those things outside of the political leadership would have to take place?
Of course. These, of course, are the most important things of all. And some of these are happening. Look at, for example, the homeschooling movement. Now, the American K through 12 educational system, as well as the university system, is quite corrupt. And what has happened is that about 3 or 4% of American parents have taken upon themselves the enormous burden of homeschooling their children. And they've made up little societies among themselves. These are, in fact, alternative societies. They've taken back education. Now, what would have to happen for America to return to what it had been would be much greater local control of education. Consider that back in 1940, when this country was half the size that it is today, you had 10 times as many school districts as we have today. This means that for parents to regain the kind of control over public education that their grandparents had, you would have to divide the current number of school districts by a factor of 20. The average school district would have to become 5% of what it is today. This means that the large high schools that we now have, especially high schools, would have to be dismantled. Oh, yes, supposedly we get tremendous educational benefits, laboratories, et cetera, et cetera. Fact is, however, that the more of these supposed advantages we've gotten in public education, the dumber have been the results. The dumber have been the people coming out of them. We are graduating illiterates. You shouldn't be surprised to hear that the best results in terms of educational outcomes in American public education are in states that spend the least but have the smallest school districts, Utah being number one. Why? Well, because you have small districts and parents control the education, which doesn't mean they're uniformly great. It just means that they are generally in control of people who actually care about the education of the children. The Americans would have to take upon themselves a whole bunch of functions which they have given up to the state.
Is it likely that the average American can be persuaded to shoulder that responsibility?
I don't know whether it's likely or not, but I know that it's the essential condition for it to be possible if for somebody to try to explain to the American people just how essential this is. And no one is trying to do that. Donald Trump and his friends have vied with the left to promise services. We will take care of this for you. We will take care of that for you. Instead of saying, look, if you want to be free, you got to take care of yourselves. If you want a Republican government, act like Republicans with a small r.
And that's going to require people to stop trying to solve so many things with politics in the first place. Since it seems like everything we hand over to politics or tell politicians, here, you fix this, turns into a power struggle at some point.
You fix this means not just pay somebody to do it, but authorize them to do it and to shove aside anybody who objects. Look, government by experts has been the dream of progressives from day one. And it's not a new dream. It was a dream of the royal intendants under the French monarchy prior to the Revolution. The American Revolution took power back to the people. And if we are going to keep the republic, we've got to relearn those basic lessons. Now, we're not going to relearn them unless somebody sets out to teach them. And so far, I haven't seen anybody trying to do that.
Here's where I'm going to disagree with you slightly, only because I see you through your writings trying to get people to focus on those first principles. That's how I spend my days. That's how my co-host Connor Boyack spends his days. We're doing it on a very small level, but I wouldn't even discount that as saying, well, that was that's wasted effort.
Of course not. No. I didn't mean that. What I meant is that, of course, it's talking to you right now. Your podcast will reach some thousands of people, all of which is very nice. It would be so much nicer if the President of the United States, or someone seriously vying for the presidency, therefore who had the attention of the country, would use his access not so much as a pulpit, but as a means of reminding the American people of certain basic realities. Look, if you want to be free, you got to take things upon yourselves. Look, I'm a college professor. What do I do? Well, what did I do before I retired? And what do I do when I lecture now? I try to get young people to understand these things and to go out and talk about these things with their neighbors, which, of course, is what I'm doing with you right now.
I want to throw one final question to you. And let's end this on a very positive note. What is one thing that those listening to the sound of our voices can do today to start building that the kind of understanding and the kind of character to be the person who is fit to live in an American republic?
Right after 9/11, the people were afraid to fly. One of the first flights that took off, the pilot got on the public address system and said, "Hello, my name is Captain Jones, and I want to ask you to turn to the person sitting next to you. Introduce yourselves to one another and assure one another that nobody is going to hijack this airplane." Why? Because you are going to prevent it. You two sitting next to one another aren't going to let it happen. So my advice for the one fundamental thing that you can do to return America to its Republican with a lower R status is to talk to your neighbor and say, you know what? I don't give a damn what X, Y, or Z says. You and I aren't going to act except in the way that we should as good Republicans.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time, Angelo Codevilla. Again, the article is called After the Republic. We will link to your article, The Cold Civil War. Thanks again for appearing with us on the Society and the State podcast.
You're welcome.
For those who want to check out Angelo's article, The Cold Civil War, again, you will find it at societyandthestate.com/25.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.